Welcome back. In my last video, I quickly explained the purpose of the series, and the reason is very simple. I want to set the right expectations. So, if you're interested in the idea or the concept of this series, welcome back. And today we will get started. We will dip our toes in the water and get started with the Python and the PANOS API. And by the end of this video, you will have built a small script to extract information from the firewall while we learn new concepts of Python and the PANOS API. So I hope you're ready, and let's get started. So first of all, if you have your Visual Studio Code open, you can first open your terminal. So either by clicking this icon here in the top, like this, or you could go to View Terminal as well to open it. So then you will get a terminal below. So in this terminal, we can execute commands, Python commands, but also commands on the operating system. As I mentioned in the lab requirements, we prefer some Linux machine with a desktop like Ubuntu desktop or a Mac. So that makes things much easier. So what happens is we will write our scripts in Visual Studio Code and execute them there as well. If you like to execute them from outside of Visual Code, you can. But if you want to follow along and you're new to all of this, just follow along with me. So let's go. How do we start with the API? So in most cases, you will start with an API key. So you want to generate an API key that you will use as a combination of, let's say, username and password to authenticate to the firewall. So you can generate an API key under your user, so it will have the same rights as or privileges as your user. So how do I do that? How do I get started? So with anything that is related to APIs and something new that you want to learn, there's most of the time a documentation and a getting started page. So let's see if Palo Alto has that as well. So if we open a new tab and we Google, let's say PANOS API usage guide, we will see that we have some documentation here. Let's try this one. Perfect. First of all, you will see that Palo Alto has different versions. So in our case, we're working with 10.1. Again, in the lab requirements, I mentioned that's better to have a 10.1 version of the firewall. So let's go to 10.1 just to be sure that the syntax hasn't changed. Cost you anything, so just to be sure that maybe the syntax has changed or something like that. Always when you're going through documentation, try to get the version that you're working on, so it won't give you any surprises. So we see what do you want to do. You see the first step is get your API key. You see a difference between XML and REST API. This is something I have to clarify. So Palo Alto Networks had an XML API since a long time, and this is the API that has been on the firewall since a very long time. And since a couple of years, they added something new called a REST API. So the REST API is using more of a JSON syntax, while the XML API is using XML, of course. So because the XML is more mature and has been there for the longest, we will work with the XML API. But with the way we will work, you will be ready for the REST API, and you will understand it later in the video why I'm saying you will be ready for the REST API, because it's using JSON, and we will work with the XML API, but still be able to understand JSON and how to work with it. So first thing, get your API. I see this is the first step that we want to do. The reason why is because if you're working with APIs, in most cases, you will use an API key to authenticate the API call. You will not use a username and password. Most of the time, it will be an API key because it's much easier. And this will be in most cases when you're working with APIs. It will be some kind of a different kind of authentication most of the time with an API key. So in my case, here for Palo Alto, it says to generate an API key, make a request. So I have here a curl request that asks me to fill in the firewall IP, username, and password. So let's try that. If we copy this and go back to the terminal, we can paste it here, and this will give us the API key. So I can put the IP here. In my case, it's 192.168.100.185. Fill in the username. In my case, it's admin, default admin user, and then the password. So let's try that. And this is not the result I expected. I get a 403, invalid credentials. If you get this, it means that you have something wrong with your username and password. In my case, it's the big T instead of small t to start with. So just for your information, you could just copy paste this URL or this API call and paste it in the browser. It will give you the same result as what we're doing now. So if you say like, oh, I don't have curl at the moment or something like that, just copy paste this URL and paste it in the browser. It will give you the same result. In my case, we'll just do it here. And what's the result? You will get some response in XML. So you see these tags here, XML tags, response, status, success, which is good. Result, you see it has a tag called key. And if we look between these tags here, we'll see that we have our key. So the key will start with LU, or the Palo Alto keys will start with LU and end with an equal sign. So in my case, it's like this. I can copy that, and now I have my key to use in future API calls. So as you can see at the first example, when I mistyped my password, it has the status error, and now it has the status success. So maybe in the future we could use these status responses to understand or to know if our call was successfully done or not. But that's for a later stage. For now, we need the API key, so we can just build a new file. That will be our first Python script. Go to File, New Text File, and we will start with a hash. We will start with a hash because this is how we comment out a one line, or to add a one line comment in Python. So now I can just paste my key, and we will use it as a reference because here in the prompt things will change, so this API key will get lost. So just as a reference point, we will put it here in the script. As I mentioned, we add the hash, so it's a comment. I add a space, so when I select it, I won't select the hash key by accident. And this is how we will keep referencing the API key. In reality, from a security standpoint, of course, you will not just save your API keys or credentials or whatever in your scripts, but how we deal with that will be in a later phase. As I mentioned, this is a step-by-step process on how to learn. In the beginning, we will not complicate things. Today is a warm-up on how to get started with the API, and this is on how to secure your API keys and username and password is not in scope for this for the first sessions, let's say. So for now, we'll just keep it here, and that's it as a reference. So now we can save the file. You can name it whatever you want. Just be sure that it has .py extension at the end, so that we to run it as a Python script. So in my case, exercise 1. Let's save it. So now it's saved. So we have the API key that we can use to authenticate. What's next? Again, let's go to the documentation. Let's see. We see here, make your first API call. This could be interesting. Let's click on that. And we see that we have here the same, a curl request, a get, and so on. And it needs the same information, your firewall. And instead of now having a username and password, it has a key equals the API key. So here we'll put the API key, and this command here is the command that is used in this example it's the command show system info. We can kind of extract it from the information that's here. This is the command show system info, and because it's XML, this is the opposite. So this is the last tag, the closing of it, the closing tag of it, and so on. If you know XML, you know that always have the same hierarchy, or this is, if this is the parent, you will have the parent tag closing tag here with a slash, and this is the child, you will have the same tag with the slash. So these are the opening tags and the closing tags. So this is the command show system info, a great way to start. But instead of doing curl, because we said we were going to learn Python, we're not going to do a curl request all the time. So we'll just copy the URL, and we will not copy the rest of the command. So just purely the URL like that. Let's copy it and go back to the script. So again, just to add it as a comment, we can add the hash, paste the URL, and let's see and save it. So when we do a API call in Python, we don't use curl. You could, but we don't use it. We use something called requests. And requests is a library, is a module that you can import in Python. So how do we import a library or a module? We type in import. In our case, we need requests. So this is how we do it, right? So let's see if we can already run that. So to run it, we type Python 3. And we will type the name of the file. And we get an error. So when you get an error like this, first of all, most of the time it will show you on which line. So in our case, it's line 1. Okay, this is where our import request is. And it also gives you some or the information or the code that's on that line, and for me it's import request, and it says no module named requests. So module or a library is something that you can import. What this is someone wrote code that you can reuse. So someone built or wrote a lot of code and puts it like in a zip, and you could use that code and import it and use all the function and logic and algorithms that this person used. So it's like an app that you download from the App Store, but to use it. But of course, if you want to use the app, you have to install it. In our case, we didn't install it yet. How does Python know where to get this information? So our Play Store, if you want to compare it like the Play Store and Apple Store, is with Python is pip. So we can do pip 3 install, and then we type requests. This is now us going to the Apple Store or Play Store, downloading the app so that we can use the app in Python. So if I do this, you will see that it will start downloading our app, and then in reality our library or module, and now it's done. So if you get here successfully installed, all of this is okay. So now if we run the script again, it says nothing. Why? Because we're not doing anything. We just imported this library or module, and that's it. We didn't do anything to be able to see something in the prompt. But the good thing is this error is gone. The reason why I showed you this error, because a lot of times I see a lot of people asking me about I have an error that says no module named, and they downloaded some script from GitHub that they found interesting, and then they got stuck with this. You could easily Google this and get a response from Stack Overflow, Google, and so on. It's a very common error, but I deliberately left it here so that we remember that when you see something like this, no module named X, that you have to install it with pip, because you're importing it, you're trying to use the app, but you didn't install it in the first place. So why did I want to install a request? Because request is kind of a curl. I'm not saying it is curl. It is something like curl. It has a lot of functionality that you could use to get request URLs or do API calls. Fill in. You could even fill in forms and post credentials and a lot of things that you could do with requests. But in our case, we will use it to do API calls. So If we go through the process, how do we now make a request like we did with curl for this API call? So how we do it is we type in requests and then get, okay, and then we open these parentheses, we add the double quote, and then we should have the URL here. So let's copy paste it and let's fill it in. Of course, we have our IP 192.168.100.185 in my case, and then we have the API key, which we conveniently stored here. That's the API key. Just be aware that when you double click here, it never takes in the equal signs at the end. So please be sure to select it, because this happens a lot, and it happened to me a lot of times that I'm just thinking, what did I do wrong? Because I copied it like this. I tried to copy it like this. So please do select it manually up to the L in the beginning. So now we seem to have a decent API call to mimic the curl command. So let's see if that works. We didn't get anything. So what's the issue here? Well, there's they didn't give us an error, right? So it seems to be a valid syntax, okay, but we didn't get anything. So in Python we have something. We have a function called print. So what that will do, it will print something to the screen. So we could use print to print the result to the screen. Let's try that. So I type in print. Let's open parentheses, and at the end I will close it because I have to add the closing parentheses, of course, and then save it. Let's run it again. So now we get an error. This is not good, but we're going forward. At least we have some output now. If we look at the error, we see that, okay, caused by SSL error, cert verification error, certificate verify failed, certificate verify failed, unable to get local issuer certificate. If you're a security professional, you know that if you go to a website with a self-signed certificate, even in the browser, it will give you like an error. You have to click continue and so on. So the same happens with requests, but requests will have to bypass this to be able to do a request to a self-signed certificate. Of course, you also have to bypass it the same way you have to do it in the browser. So how do we do that in requests? At the end, we just add a simple thing, which is verify equals false. So after this quote, after these double quotes, we will add a comma. We type verify equals false with a big F. So the F should be big. Verify equals false. Let's save that again, and let's see if we bypass the self-signed certificate like that. Of course, in production, in your environment at home, if you have a real certificate, not a self-signed certificate, a valid certificate, you don't have to do that, of course. But in our case, because it's a lab, it's a self-signed certificate, we have to do verify equals false, and this is how we will do that. So if we go to requests, we have the command here. We printed it out, but the result is not interesting at all. We just get a response 200, which seems to be an HTTP 200 response, I assume. I don't know. So maybe it's HTTP code 200, which is okay. It's okay, but in the end, I don't get the result, because if I would take this same URL, right? I just copied the same URL with the key and everything, right? And I add it to the browser. Let's try it here. I paste it here. I press enter. Oh, this is totally different than the 200 that we got. We got a response, same as with the API key. So we have a response with status success. We have a result. And then with the API key, in between the result tags, we got the key, which had the key. Now we have something called system, and in that we have a lot of information, right? So how does that differ from what we're doing here? So something is wrong, and we should try to see the documentation of request why we don't get the same output. So when we work with libraries, they always have amazing documentation. We could look up that documentation, but something that really helps as well is installing Python or IDE extensions. In our case, with Visual Studio Code, we have extensions here. We can type Python in the top. If we type Python here, you'll see a lot of Python extensions. In our case, we want the one by Microsoft, as Visual Studio Code is Microsoft. So we will install it here. Clicking install, it will start installing it. At a certain moment, it will be installed. Perfect. Now it's disabled and uninstalled, so it means it's installed. So we can disable it now. So if we go, for example, you already see that some colors has changed. So what happens here is these extensions will help you in marking things that are probably an error. It will give you better color coding. It will help you, provide you some documentation, and so on. So for example, now if I go over request, you see I already got some documentation. Okay. So let's say you don't have this, or you want to look up more advanced documentation. How would you do that? You could just type in Google requests module documentation, and the first URL here, requests, you click on it, and you can start reading documentation. So looking at that, it's similar to what we got in the IDE here. Let's see if we can find something. So we have status code, looks like the 200 also that we received, and then you have a lot of different things. One of the things here is, for example, .text. It seems that it provides a response, a JSON response. So this might be interesting. So let's try to get that. So what they did here in the documentation is they didn't just do the request, okay? In this case, it's a post actually, but they didn't just do the request get and print it out to the screen. No, they stored it in a variable, because it says r equals and then this. So they got the output from this command and put it in a variable. A variable in Python is like a bucket. It can be different things. It can be text. It can be a number. It can be another bucket. It can be a lot of things. So variables are ways to store information. And this is how it's done. If you worked with a firewall, as we were giving an analogy, because we're working with Palo Alto Networks firewalls, if you create an address, it has a name and it has a value, right? So for example, if I call my object web1, that's the name, and then the value will be the IP of web1. This is my address object. But I can also have an address group. I can also have a service object. I can have a service group object. So variables is something similar. It's an object in which you store some information. In my case, I want to create an object or a variable to store this output. So let me remove the print here. So it's just request. Then I also have to remove the parentheses at the end. Of course, always watch out that when you remove something, if it has parentheses in the beginning and the end, to remove both of them. So now this is my request get function, and now I want to store it somewhere. So in my case, I will store it in sys info API, for example. So again, what does this do? This takes the output of this, let's say command, if you want to call it like that, and stores it in this bucket and this variable. This is how they call them, variables. So now I have this information. This information should be equal to what we got out of this. So we saw that it in our documentation example, it called something called .text. Okay, so let's do that. We do the same exact thing. It did a print, but instead of, we didn't store it in R, we stored it in sysinfo API. So we'll use the same example of the documentation here, but instead of the R, we called it sysinfo API. So we will print sysinfo API dot text. Okay, so let's do that. Sysinfo. Oh. So you can use tab to complete because now the VS Code understands the variables and so on. So you can tab it. It most probably will show you the name. So if you click, if you tab it, then you will complete the variable name. So in our case, we don't just want to print sysinfo, because if we print sysinfo, what should we get? If we previously got this, we should have the same, because as we mentioned, we just store it in a bucket. So let's try that. And as you can see, it's the same response. We just took the output that we got here and stored it in this bucket. And that's the only thing we did. So now we want to add or access the dot text of this. And now we get the result that we saw in the browser. So now we get all of the information that we wanted to see, which is perfect. So again, why is it that in the beginning we just get a response to 100 and then we have to access text? So you have to go through the documentation and read about it. So when we when we do a request get, we get a lot of information. It's actually in itself a bucket, and in the future we will know or learn how to use the type command to understand what this bucket is. But for now, understand that when you do a request get and you want to get the real feedback or the real information that it has, that it gets, we can use the .text command. So let's continue now. Now we have the .text, which is great, but we don't know how to access specific data, because let's go over a scenario. Our customer has the following requirements. As I mentioned, so in every session we'll try to have something tangible, something real that we created, so it will keep you motivated from one part, and also so it will help you understand how you can use that in the real world. So in our scenario, the customer wants you to make like a audit file, an audit list. So let's assume the customer has a lot of firewalls, they don't have Panorama, and the audit came and said, we need the following information for all firewalls. So what do they need? They need a list of, for example, we could get the host name, right? And then we could get the, let's say, IP address. And then we could get, for example, the serial number. And then, for example, the, let's say, software version. So this is important for the audit. They want to know the host name and IP, so that as a reference, they want to know the serial number, so they can check online if they still have support, and if it's still, let's say, if it's still supported, how old it is, and so on. And for example, they want the software version to know if the software version is still supported, if it has any vulnerabilities, and so on. So this is the requirement of the customer. So how do we access this information? To be able to access this information, we could use directly the XML to access the information. Like, for example, I know that the host name, let's say, is here. So I could use this, and we have to access this these XML tags and get the value of that. But working with XML is a little bit complicated, in my opinion, and I've seen this also with a lot of people that agree with me. XML, especially if your XML or your responses become very complicated, and with a lot of children, and you have to access a specific value of these children and so on, it can get very complicated. So especially for a beginner, but even if you're used to scripting, XML can be a headache. So And as I mentioned, in the future, the API will become JSON. So the new REST API of Palo Alto Networks will be JSON, and a lot of other products of Palo Alto Networks, like some of the Cortex products, also use JSON as a response, or API response, or data exchange. So on top of that, if you're working, for example, with cloud like AWS, and a lot of or most of the API, or most of the products that support API these days are using JSON, and there is a lot of reasons for that. For example, XML maybe in general is bigger because it always has the opening tag and closing tag. On the other side, it is sometimes, let's say, um, not perfectly readable from the browser, compared with JSON, which is based on JavaScript, which all browsers support, and it's in general much smaller. Maybe XML is more readable, but in general, from a general perspective, JSON these days will be seen as the more preferred, or more, let's say, better data exchange format. So we will try to or convert this XML to JSON, so we can work with it as if it is JSON. And in Python, it is a dictionary. So a dictionary is actually a kind of same syntax as JSON, and we will have to convert the XML to JSON so we can access it like that. This will also, as I mentioned, prepare us for the future with the new API, and also help you understand when you're working. For example, you want to use the same things you learn here, and you want to use it to for example, use it for AWS or whatever. You can use the same. So how do we do that? How do we convert from XML to a dictionary, which is a JSON-like syntax? Well, again, we have an app to do that. We have a module to do that, and let's import that as well. So import, and it's called XML to dict. Very straightforward name. What does it do? Well, it changes or converts an XML to dict. So first of all, now that we have installed the plugin, it already mentions that, okay, so is not accessed, import could not be resolved from source, and so on and so on. So what do we have to do when we import something, or when we want to use an app? Of course, as I mentioned before, we want to install it. So how did we do that? pip3 install. In this case, we will install XML to dict. Let's hit enter. And now it is installed. First of all, you already see that this squiggly line below the XML to dict disappeared. So that looks great. We have it successfully installed, which is perfect. So how do I use this XML to dict? So XML to dict, again, we can look up the documentation. There's a lot of things you can do with it. But in our case, the information that we get here, that we printed here, is actually text, is a string. And how do we convert that to a dictionary? In that case, we could use something called XML to dict.parse. So, but when we will do that, we want to store this new format in a new bucket, right? So as we mentioned, it's a variable. So we want to store it in a new variable. We call it sysinfo, for example. It will be a dictionary, so we'll call it dict. So again, when we have this kind of assignment, we will actually store it in this bucket so that we can retrieve it later. So if I do this, XML to dict, and then what we will use is parse, be able to use that string. And what we will parse is, we could use, we should use this, because if we do this, we will only get 200 as before. So we need the text. So this is what we will copy and paste it here. So what we will do is, with XML to dict, we will parse and convert the XML that we get from this call, and the text of it, which is the real XML, we will convert it to JSON with this. And this JSON or dictionary, we will store it here. So We convert it to dictionary. Now, for now, if we say JSON, making working XML feel like you are working with JSON. So you can see if you go in the IDE and you install the plugin, it gives you a lot of information. So it clearly mentions that here makes working with XML feel like you're working with JSON. So now we're using JSON and dictionary interchangeably for now, just to make it easy. So in this case, I will just most of the time use JSON, but you know that in Python it's a dictionary that I'm referring to. So we're converting it from XML to a dictionary. And what are we converting? This XML that we got from this request. And what we will do with that after we convert to JSON, we will store it in this bucket here. So in theory, let's think about it. If I would print this variable, this bucket, what would it print out? Without knowing the syntax, without anything, just from what we did here, what would be the output? The output would be that it's a dictionary, the same information that we had in XML, but in a JSON-like syntax, right? So let's see. Let's print it out. Oh, of course, I already installed it. I have to run the file. So here you will see that these are the XML, because we still kept it here to print out, to compare it. We have these XML tags and so on and so on. And after we have the closing tag of the XML, we have something totally different. We have something in between, like these brackets, these squirrely brackets. And in between that, you have the same as the XML response, result, system, and so on. So this is the dictionary that we're printing out. So if we remove this one, we don't need it anymore, because we will work with the dictionary. So now we have this dictionary here. How do we access specific data? Because in our case, the customer needs to access specific data. We don't want to give the customer a list like this. He said, no, I want it in XML, or I want it in a CSV. I want it in a very clear list. This is my requirement. I want it like this, so I can import it in Excel as a CSV. So how do we access specific data? We could easily do that with having the information now in a dictionary. So if we copy this, let's copy this syntax here. This is our JSON now, right? Let me copy it, because now this is, for me, this is not readable. I want to make it more readable. So if I go here and I type in, for example, online JSON viewer, we see a lot of things that say JSON viewer. So let's pick the first one and let's paste this here. So again, as we mentioned, this is JSON-like syntax. This is a dictionary in Python. So we pasted it here so we can get a better view. And if we click on viewer here, you will see that now the JSON viewer is putting it in a nice way so that we can easily access this information. So in our case, we need to access hostname. So if we want to access hostname, we see that we have a response tag, we have a result tag, we have a system tag, and below that we have the all of the information, and one of them is the host name tag. So in a dictionary or in JSON, how do they call this? This they call a key, and this is the value. So in our case, we need the hostname key, and the value will be this. Let's go back and let's see how we can access that. So let's just reuse the same print statement, but instead of printing all of this out, I want to only go up to this side, which is system. So how do I access it? When you access it, I need to access response, result, and then system. How do we do that? You just type in these square brackets, and we said the first thing was response. After that, we had result, and after that we had system. Don't forget the single quotes like this. In theory, this should print out all information in the system that we have here, like hostname, IP address, and so on. So the question is, what about this at status? So these at things are different because when we did the XML side of things, if we look here, it was a property for this response tag. So, but the dictionary doesn't have that, so it made the status at status, and which state the value is success. So this is what you see here, but this is not something that we will that we want to access now. But in the future, for example, if you want to understand if a request was successful, you could easily access it the same. I see a typo here, system, sorry. The same, but instead of the name, we could use at status as a name here, and it should print that out as well. So let's see if we can get the system info like this. Great. So before we had response, at status, success, result, and so on, and system. Now immediately we start at hostname. So now we know how to access a specific information with in a dictionary through just having these behind the dictionary. In our case, this variable is our dictionary. Behind it, we just add these square brackets, single quote, and the name in the hierarchy that we saw here. So we accessed response, result, system. So now we want to access specifically host name, IP address, the things that the customer requested. So how do we do that? Of course, we just continue by adding host name here. Same way, we access it. Let's try and run it again. As you can see now, I just have access to the host name. So I don't like to always type all of this again and again for these 4 things. So could we make it easier? Yes. We could just cut the dictionary in half and store it in another bucket, right? So if I want to, I could just use this. Okay. And I will store it as in a new bucket called sysinfo. In this case, we only access the system information, so we call it sysinfo system. And then we get access to system. So what happened here is that we took a subset of the whole dictionary. So before, when we printed out this the same way, it started at hostname, which this is all the system information, right? So not only are we printing it out this way now, we're storing it in a value. So when we want to access something, we only have to access it starting from system. So starting from here. So I can immediately access hostname. I can immediately access IP address. And because all of the things that I want to access are within the system, it's much easier to just store it in a new value. So what I did, I'll give you another analogy. If you have an encyclopedia and you want to access, for example, a word starting with O, for example, you have a huge amount of books. You don't need to take the whole collection with you to search for a specific word with O, right? So you could just go to the book that has the letter O and pick it out and just go through this book. This is the same thing that we are doing here. We don't need all information again to access it, as all information that we want for this audit is within system. So we just cut it in half. We say like, okay, make me a new bucket, but instead of putting all of it, just give me starting from here, from the system. So now it's much easier to print out hostname. Instead of putting it at the end of here, we will just use this simplified, let's say, dictionary that we cut in half, and we can immediately access hostname with only one of these square brackets. So let me see and see if this works. Perfect, it still works, but instead of always putting in all of that, and at the end hostname, which is very long, we immediately access it like that. So how do we get it to work like this? So we have different ways, but for now, a simple way to do that is, again, we will store it in buckets. Let's say we call this bucket hostname equals to what? Well, what we just printed out, which is the system info, and we access the hostname. So this info system now is up to here. So this is what we cut away, and we only stored this in a new variable. And how do we access it? By hostname. What else did we need? We need the IP address. Okay, this is the requirement of the customer. So we need the IP address. How is it written in the on the firewall? It's like this. So we have to copy the exact key that we're trying to access, and of course we have to rename it to IP address underscore. And the variables use underscore for the variable names. So now we have IP address. What else do we need? We said serial. So how is it called in the firewall information? Let's look it up. So again, I think it's much easier here because you can also do Control F. Seems that this specific tool doesn't work with Control F. Just also a heads up, if you're using, for example, now we're using an online JSON viewer. If you have customer data or a real production environment, you don't use these online tools, right? Because you will put out sensitive data, and this is not something that you want. So because it's our lab here, it's no issue to use it because it's easier. Also, I have to put in the requirements like install some JSON plugin and so on and so on. This is much easier for everyone to access it and to not make the requirements too complicated, to not demotivate you to get started. So this is why we use this online JSON viewer. But in reality, you will have a lot of times local tools, like for example in your IDE, something to view JSON much nicer like this. You can have local browser plugins. You even have specific apps for these kind of things. So now we're doing it online, but of course you don't know what they will do with this data. This is just a lab firewall. I don't care that much about it. So this is why we use it online. But again, if you're using real data, please don't use an online JSON viewer. You install a plugin. If you really want to get started with it and you say, okay, I really want something, Google online, you will find a lot of solutions on how to use a decent JSON viewer on your PC without putting it all online in some website. So again, we're looking for serial. This is my serial. It's just called serial. Very easy. And then the last thing that we need was the software version. What is the software version? And this is SW version, in my case 10.1.7. I will call it PANOS version. So copy it, and the name was SW version. So now we stored all of these in buckets. This is a variable, a bucket. This is a variable, a bucket. This is a variable, and this is a variable. So this variable has what? Has the hostname information, like this, as a text. This variable has an IP address. This variable has a serial number, and this variable has a PANOS version. So now, how do we print it? We could use the print statement and do the following, like print hostname, and then print this and print that. First of all, it will not be in the syntax with the commas in between and in CSV style. It was a requirement from the customer to have it like this so that it can import it in Excel. So this won't work. We could do like this plus that, but maybe you will have some number in between, which will not be able to add it. You will not be able to add it together. So what's the best way? So first of all, let's just type out the text that we need. Okay. and we will print out, or we will print out a string. A string, as we mentioned before, it's when you have double these text in between double quotes. This is a string, and this is what we will use to print it out. So when we print a string, let's see, let's say it's a host name, double point, and we want to have the host name here. Could I just print it here? For example, copy the variable name and put it here, and let's see if it works. It does not. You see, it didn't replace it with the host name, it just puts in host name. So this string takes things literally. It says, okay, I type host name here, that's what it is. I will print out host name. I don't know about this variable here. You don't mention this variable here. It could have the same name. It doesn't matter. It's just a string. It's just text. It doesn't matter. Is there a way that we could print it out with having the variables? Yes. If we have just this normal string and we just add the small letter f in front of this double quote here. So just if you have this string, you just add an f in front. You see that the f even became blue. And then we put hostname in between these curly brackets like this. So in VS Code, what's easy, if you click a word and it selects it, and you do like parentheses, brackets, or whatever, it will fill it in. So it will just add the not only the first parentheses or bracket, but also the last one. So now we have an f in front of these quotes for the string, and we put this host name, the name of the variable, in between these brackets, and let's see if that works. Look at that. Now, with just putting the f in front of the opening, in front of the quotes, double quotes, just a small f, and by adding the host name in these curly brackets, suddenly now Python knows how to interpret this. So just for your information, this is what they call an f string, and this f string is relatively recent in Python. So this is relatively new. Before, there's other ways that you could print by adding with a plus or with the percentage sign s or dot format and so on. I like this because it's very easy, and especially while we're beginning, this is perfect. But if you're running an older version, I think it came out somewhere Python 3.6 or something like that. So if you're running a Python 2 or a very early version of Python 3, it will not support it, so most probably you will get an error. So be sure that if you get an error for that and it says that it doesn't recognize it, just be sure that you're running a recent version of Python, and you could know your Python version by doing dash big V. So in my case, it's 3.9.6. So by running this command, dash big V, not a small v, you will get the Python version. So now that we know how we can add these, the rest should be quite simple, right? So if we do now comma, because everything that I type without these curly brackets will be text. So this comma will be text. The next thing that we will type is IP address, double point, and then we want this IP address variable. What do? Yes, we add it between these squirrely brackets like that. Also, you see that the color changes. This is the string, this is the text, and this one, you see that the purple squirrely brackets and the light blue name of the variable. So again, the comma will be text. We just type it. Everything outside of these squirrely brackets will be text, and everything within will be translated. Let's say this hostname will be translated to the real hostname of this, or the value of this bucket variable, which is hostname, and so on. So let's continue. We have the serial number, and we will also put it in between these squirrely brackets. Serial, it's called the variable. Continue with the regular text. PANOS version, we will call it, and then square brackets and add the variable which is PANOS version. So this should print out what we need. Let's see if that works. Perfect. This is what the customer requested. It's all separated with a comma on one line. This is all the information they requested. So we could later write it in for example, if we have multiple firewalls, loop over all the firewalls, get all of the information of the firewalls. We could also write it in a real CSV file or Excel file for the auditor to open it. But for now, this is sufficient for us to start with. And how do I save this in a file? Well, if you really want to save it in a file right now, we could just, when you run the script, you can add the default OS command or function to pipe it into the file, for example, audit.csv, for example. Okay, so when it runs this command, it will pipe it into this file. And if I do now, for example, audit. Now, if I open this file, you see that the information is there. So this is perfect to get you started. If you're running a script now, you said, okay, this is very interesting. I want to use it somewhere for a specific requirement I have, and I need to get this information, but I want it in a file. Now you know how to do that before going into how to open Excel sheets or CSV files and to close them and to edit them and so on. As this is a topic for later, we will for sure get to it, but we have to start from the beginning. So this is a little bit what I wanted to do for the first session. I think this is enough for now. So what can you do? You could just practice this information. Try to get other fields. Try to get other fields from the same show info command, and we will try to also later explain to you how we can know which API call to make, because now we just took this from the documentation. We have no idea how they got it. We have no idea how to use it. So in the next session or video, we will try to explain what can we use to get the information, because we went through the API documentation, but of course the API documentation won't explain everything to you. The API documentation will give you examples, but at some point you have to be able to know what information you want and how to actually use the API. But it won't explain every single thing that you can get through API. So there are some things that are on the box itself. Palo Alto has amazing tools on the firewall itself, so you don't need any internet or whatever to access information or to understand how the API works and to do the API calls. So in the next session, we will cover that before continuing and seeing how we can change configuration and how we can loop over things. So this is a little bit what I wanted to cover in this video. So what did we cover? We from an API, a PANOS API perspective. Let us put it like this. From a PANOS API perspective, we did the following. We generated an API key. We did our first API call to get information. So this is a little bit the first step. From a Python perspective, what did we do? From a Python perspective, we actually started and learning some things. We learned about strings. Actually, more like variables. We learned about variables. Again, these are these buckets. It can be text, which are strings. It can be numbers. It can be a dictionary, as this is the case. It can be a lot of things. So we learned about variables, how we can assign information to a variable or a bucket, and this is one thing. We also learned about how to import and pip install packages or libraries, modules. This is another thing. It's a very important thing, because now if you open a script, you will see like, okay, it has a, if you read through the README, for example, of a GitHub page, it says, pip install. And okay, what is pip install? Now you understand what pip install is. If you open a script, for example, at the top it says import X. Now you know, okay, this is a module that we import. This is code from someone else who wrote that we can reuse in our script. So another thing that we learned is the f string, which we use to print text, which we use to print text with the actual variables in it to in one time. We also learn about requests. We actually just barely started with requests because, as I mentioned, request is an amazing module that has a huge amount of things that you can do with it. But we started learning requests. Another thing that we started learning is XML to dict, to convert an XML file to a dictionary. And of course, also we learned how to access information in a dictionary. So info in a dictionary. So this is a little bit the things that we covered today that we learned. So it's not nothing, even though it's a warm-up session. We learned a lot of things regarding to PANOS API and Python, and 2, we have an actual script running. So this is great. This is something that you that is real, something that you can implement in the future in production. But for now, let's stick to the lab, especially if you're still learning. But this is what I wanted to cover. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments if this was okay for someone who doesn't know Python or PANOS API, if it was too fast, if it was too slow, if it was too complicated. Also, if you wrote your script and you're stuck somewhere, well, maybe you could just upload it to GitHub and post it in the comments, and I'll try to see if I have the time to go over it and see what the issue is. But normally, if you follow these instructions and you covered or you did the lab requirements, everything should work fine. And again, just practice with the same show system info API call. Try to access some other fields and try to get it in your fingers. And by the next video, you will have a better understanding of everything that I mentioned here. So that was it for today. Thank you very much, and until the next time.